Mr. President, 20 years ago this week, Joe Biden and other politicians in both parties gave a gift to the Communist Party: permanent most favored nation status. Permanent most favored nation status is a trade privilege we grant to most countries who are members of the World Trade Organization. It places lower tariffs and fewer restrictions on those countries' goods. But historically, our trade laws have treated hostile countries differently. Communist countries, countries that cheat on trade, human rights abusers. In other words, countries exactly like Communist China. A few of those countries, like Cuba and North Korea, are denied most favored nation status outright. What few goods their miserable socialist economies produce face steep tariffs, sanctions, and other restrictions, which is one reason why you don't see too many made in North Korea items on your local store shelves. Other countries historically have faced a yearly review of their trading privileges with the United States, in which the President and Congress could assess the human rights and trade abuses ongoing in those countries, and then determine whether it's in our interest to grant those trading privileges for another year. Communist China was one of those countries subject to yearly review. At least it was until 20 years ago. This yearly review led to spirited debates about whether Communist China should be stripped of its trading privileges, or whether it deserved a temporary reprieve. It put a spotlight on the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party, and it used our market as leverage to advance our interests. But of course, the Chinese Communist Party didn't like that, not one bit. Neither, sadly, did many bankers and businessmen here in America, who seemed a little more concerned about making money than pressuring Communist China to reform. So this China lobby pushed hard to get rid of the annual vote and give China permanent most favored nation status. And 20 years ago this week, they finally won. Here's how our Senator Joe Biden defended his vote at the time to give a big gift to Communist China. He said, trade concessions are all a one-way deal. They drop tariffs. They drop non-market barriers. They agree to increase protection of our intellectual property laws. So that's what Joe Biden said at the time, but what actually happened? Were all the trade concessions one way, as he predicted? In fact, they were, but not the way that Joe Biden intended, because all trade concessions ended up benefiting Beijing while devastating America. The main consequence of that decision was to make it harder to put tariffs on China in response to human rights and trade abuses. And it sent a strong signal to businesses and banks that China was open for business for good. So the gold rush to China was on. In the 2 decades that follow, America invested more than $200 billion in China. Most of that money went to building factories and training workers over there, while our factories were dismantled and our workers were laid off. In the 6 years that followed that vote, manufacturing employment plunged by 18% as cheap Chinese goods flooded our market and as our factories were dismantled and offshored to China. The vote to give trade privileges to Communist China is just more evidence of the alternate reality that politicians like Joe Biden have been living in for decades. There's a consistent pattern. They treat our enemies like friends and our friends like enemies, and the American people suffer because of it. Well, 20 years of getting ripped off by China is more than long enough. That's why I'm introducing a bill that would repeal China's permanent most favored nation status and return us to the older way, where China's trade status would be assessed by the President and Congress every year. My bill would make businesses think twice before sending more American jobs overseas to China, and it would add new human rights and trade standards that China must work toward to qualify for most favored nation status. This would put a spotlight on the Communist Party's most recent crimes, including its use of slave labor and concentration camps in Turkestan. And ultimately, repealing China's most favored nation status would force regular votes in Congress, so politicians like Joe Biden have to go on the record about who they serve: the American people or the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. President, I yield the floor.